the long, strange history of Hollywood bombs, one movie stands alone, not because it failed, but because it was so expensive, so empty, so forgotten and so toxic that almost no one has claimed responsibility for it since. Released in August 2002, The Adventures of Pluto Nash wasn't just a misfire, it was a total system failure. A film that cost over $100 million and earned less than $7. A comedy without laughs. A sci-fi adventure without stakes. A production so disjointed and overstuffed, even its star, Eddie Murphy, has never really explained what the hell happened. Theaters were nearly empty on opening weekend. The few critics who showed up eviscerated it. The New York Times called it a huge, hollow, grinning mistake. Roger Ebert said it had all the fun of a colonoscopy. And audiences, they didn't even hate it. They just didn't care. It made $2.2 million in its first weekend and $7.1 million total against a budget that ballooned beyond comprehension. One executive at Warner Brothers reportedly called it a humiliation, and yet no one seemed to get fired and no lessons were learned. It vanished quietly, as if it had never existed. But Pluto Nash did something bigger than bomb. It quietly killed a studio, one trying to play the blockbuster game with none of the skills. Today we talk about franchise fatigue, streaming bubbles, and $200 million flops. But 2 decades ago, Pluto Nash already showed us what was coming. Before Pluto Nash was a $100 million punchline, before Castle Rock was a ghost brand buried inside Warner Brothers, it was one of the most respected names in Hollywood, a studio that believed, almost stubbornly, in the power of good writing. Castle Rock Entertainment was founded in 1987 by a group of idealists. Rob Reiner, the director of Stand By Me and The Princess Bride, producer Andy Scheinman, Columbia Pictures executive Glenn Padnick, and investment banker turned media mogul Alan Horn. The name Castle Rock was a nod to Stephen King's fictional town, fitting since King's stories would become part of the company's DNA. Unlike the major studios, Castle Rock wasn't designed to chase blockbusters. It was built on scripts, and for a brief golden period in the 90s, that philosophy worked better than anyone expected. Their first major hit was When Harry Met Sally in 1989, a romantic comedy with no high concept, no franchise potential, and no guaranteed box office draw. Just a great script by Nora Ephron and an airtight cast. It became a phenomenon. From there, Castle Rock built a reputation for intelligent, prestige films with emotional weight. Misery, 1990. It contained character-driven Stephen King thriller, A Few Good Men, 1992. A courtroom drama with no action but enough tension to feel like a war film. The Shawshank Redemption, 1994. Critically ignored at release, now widely considered the best film ever made. At the same time, Castle Rock made room for smaller, character-driven comedies and dramas. These were films that didn't test well, didn't win opening weekends, but lasted. Films like City Slickers, In the Line of Fire, and The American President. They also took big swings on television. In 1989, Castle Rock partnered with a young comedian named Jerry Seinfeld to create a sitcom about, well, nothing. By 1994, Seinfeld was the most watched show in America. Castle Rock's approach was unusual for the time. Give writers autonomy. Avoid micromanaging directors. Don't overtest or rewrite for mass appeal. And it worked, critically, commercially, and culturally, for a while. But as Castle Rock grew, so did the pressure to compete. By the mid-1990s, they were no longer an indie darling. They were a Warner Brothers subsidiary, expected to deliver at the same level as studios chasing Independence Day, Jurassic Park, and Titanic. The cracks started to show. While the 1990s were Castle Rock's creative peak, they were also the beginning of its identity crisis. The studio that once said no to marketing-led films began saying yes, often for the sake of relationships, contracts, or the illusion of momentum. And then there was Alan Horn. As Castle Rock's CEO, Horn was a stabilizing force, a businessman who understood storytelling. He had a rare ability to protect writers while navigating the cold realities of studio financing. But in 1998, Horn left Castle Rock to become president of Warner Brothers. With Horn gone, Castle Rock's vision became less clear. New leadership leaned more heavily on test screening data, marketing forecasts, and genre trends. More projects got greenlit only because they looked good on paper, and that's how something like The Adventures of Pluto Nash could get made. If Castle Rock in 1992 would have rejected Pluto Nash as a confused sci-fi vanity project, Castle Rock in 2000 greenlit it with enthusiasm, or at least with resignation. After all, Eddie Murphy was still bankable. Science fiction was hot. The budget looked high, but Moon Vegas sounded marketable. So, why not? This was the fatal shift. Castle Rock was now approving $100 million comedies with no clear audience, no tested premise, and a bloated effects budget. The beginning of the end. You can see the transition in their late 90s and early 2000s slate. Fewer awards contenders, more middle-of-the-road comedies, more safe bets that never paid off. And yet, no one inside the studio seemed to realize they were drifting. Or if they did, they didn't say anything. By then, Castle Rock was a name on the poster, not the guiding force behind it. Creative control had shifted back to the top of the Warner Brothers chain. In interviews years later, even Rob Reiner would admit that the studio he helped build got away from the vision. And Alan Horn, while now running Disney, expressed a similar sentiment. What makes Castle Rock's collapse especially tragic is that there was no scandal, no embezzlement, no lawsuits, and all of it, somehow, led to a movie about a lunar nightclub owner named Pluto Nash. A movie so disconnected from its own audience, its own tone, and even its own star, that by the time it came out, no one involved even tried to promote it. The Adventures of Pluto Nash officially entered production in 2000. It was, on paper, a comedy heist movie set on the moon, a futuristic Las Vegas-style colony where a nightclub owner named Pluto Nash battles corrupt corporate overlords trying to buy him out. There were robot bartenders, laser guns, space cops, moon mafia, even a clone subplot. It was everything and nothing at the same time, a Frankenstein's monster of half-baked genre ideas cobbled together with no clear vision of who the audience was or what the movie wanted to be. And yet, the studio committed more than $100 million to bring it to life. How? Because it had Eddie Murphy. At the time, Murphy was still considered one of the most bankable names in Hollywood. His 80s run had been unstoppable. Beverly Hills Cop, Coming to America, Trading Places, and even though the 90s had been uneven, he'd found new momentum with The Nutty Professor and Dr. Dolittle. Studios were betting that Murphy's name alone could carry a film. But by 1999, that bet was already starting to wobble. Murphy's projects were getting bigger, louder, and less coherent. His performance style had shifted, less edgy, more slapstick. And while his films still opened well, they rarely had legs. There were whispers in the industry that Murphy had stopped reading scripts closely, that he was choosing projects based on convenience and cashing checks. Still, Castle Rock saw an opportunity. The project had been lingering in development hell for years, passed around as a curiosity, occasionally re-optioned, never actually made. No one wanted it, which, in Hollywood, is sometimes enough reason to say yes. The original script for Pluto Nash had been written years earlier, reportedly in the early 90s. At that point, it was more of a sci-fi crime caper, rougher around the edges, with more bite and less cartoon logic. But as the film entered pre-production, it underwent major rewrites to make it more family-friendly. The edge was shaved off, the tone was softened, and the jokes were defanged. The heist plot gave way to bizarre moon colony politics and forgettable side characters. And most of all, Pluto Nash, originally envisioned as a reluctant anti-hero, was now just Eddie Murphy in a jumpsuit. The director was Ron Underwood, best known for Tremors and City Slickers. Talented, sure, but not exactly a science fiction guy, not an action guy, and certainly not the kind of director who could wrestle a bloated $100 million comedy into something coherent. By all accounts, Underwood was a professional on set, but the script was constantly in flux. Tone notes from the studio conflicted with Murphy's instincts. New pages arrived midweek. Characters were introduced and dropped. The production moved forward, but no one seemed to know what they were actually making. Filming began at Universal Studios with massive soundstage builds to simulate the moon base. Designers constructed entire Moon Vegas interiors, gaudy casinos, space lounges, neon-lit sidewalks. Costumes were elaborate. Special effects were handled by several teams. There were robots, hover cars, holograms, plasma guns. It all looked expensive, but it just didn't look good. Even internally, crew members were baffled. A gaffer later told The Hollywood Reporter that it felt like they were making a parody, but nobody was in on the joke. Reports from the set describe Murphy as quiet, sometimes disengaged, occasionally rewriting his own lines. He didn't improvise much. He didn't bond with the cast. In fact, the only real spark of life came from Luis Guzman, whose scenes as a two-bit hustler briefly inject some actual humor. But Guzman had barely 10 minutes of screen time. The tone was confusing. Was this a satire, a children's movie, a campy homage to 1950s pulp, a sci-fi gangster flick? No one knew, and worse, no one asked. As production wrapped, the total spend had crept toward $120 million, with post-production still ahead. Executives were already nervous, but they hoped the edit could save it. The first rough cut was shown to Warner Brothers and Castle Rock executives sometime in early 2002. The reaction was disastrous. The pacing dragged. The jokes fell flat. The effects were clunky. But the real issue, according to internal memos later leaked to Variety, was tone. It had no tone. It wasn't funny enough to be a comedy. It wasn't exciting enough to be action. It wasn't smart enough to be satire. And Eddie Murphy's performance, dry, almost sedated, couldn't anchor it. The studio scrambled. Re-edits were ordered. Alternate lines were dubbed in. But no major reshoots took place, likely because the production had already blown through its budget. The only rescue plan left was to quietly dump the film and hope no one noticed. Warner Brothers slotted the release for mid-August, traditionally one of the weakest weekends of the year. There was no significant marketing push, no interview tour. Murphy never sat for press. Test audience feedback was so low that Castle Rock actually pulled promotional support. By the time Pluto Nash was released, it had already been buried. On August 16, 2002, The Adventures of Pluto Nash opened in 2,320 theaters across the United States. It slipped into cinemas like a film being released out of contractual obligation, which, by all indications, is exactly what it was. Theaters were empty. Most audiences didn't even know the film existed until they saw the title on a marquee. Some thought it was a kids' movie, others thought it was a joke. A few paid to see it out of morbid curiosity. On its opening weekend, Pluto Nash grossed just $2.2 million. That worked out to under $1,000 per screen. By industry standards, it was a catastrophic number, but it would get worse. The reviews began trickling in on Friday morning. Roger Ebert gave it 1 star, writing, "Every once in a long while, a movie will come along that is so inexplicably bad it defies belief. This is that movie." The New York Times called it a colossal failure of tone, imagination, and intent. Variety referred to it as dead on arrival. Entertainment Weekly gave it an F. Critics didn't just dislike the movie, they disavowed it. It wasn't funny, it wasn't strange enough to be camp, and it wasn't competent enough to be forgettable. It sat in a kind of uncanny valley, too boring to be good, too bland to be interesting, and too expensive to ignore. By the end of its theatrical run, the film had earned just $7.1 million against a production budget of over $100 million, making it one of the biggest money losers in studio history. What made the failure even more baffling was that no one stepped forward to take ownership of it. It was as if the movie had willed itself into existence, flopped, and vanished without a trace. Inside Warner Brothers, there were whispers, but no formal fallout. Some executives blamed Ron Underwood, saying he lacked the edge to pull off satire. Others blamed Murphy, claiming he had phoned in the performance and resisted rewrites. Some blamed the rewrites themselves, which had neutered the story and turned a potentially sharp comedy into a formless corporate product. At Castle Rock, the implications were immediate, even if they weren't public. A string of poorly performing films had already put pressure on the studio's leadership. Within months, Castle Rock's film division was quietly folded into Warner Brothers. Projects in development were either canceled or reassigned. Remaining staff were absorbed or laid off. The brand would survive in television, but its days as a film studio were over. Eddie Murphy moved on. His next few films, I Spy, Showtime, The Haunted Mansion, continued the downward spiral. In 2006, he mounted a comeback with Dreamgirls, earning an Oscar nomination and a standing ovation at the Golden Globes. In interviews years later, he would joke about Pluto Nash. I cashed that check, and they can't take it back.
And did it feel right when you were on set? Like, did it click right away when you got there, or did you have to get back into the character a little bit?
It clicked right in. Because the movies are on all the time.
It's true.
Yeah, so you see them and you see these actors and it falls right in. And if you work with actors that you were in a successful movie with them, it's this great feeling when you get around each other and you work, hey, we were in that hit together. And
Yeah.
It's the exact opposite. When you see somebody, if you were in a movie with them and you see them out, it's kind of like, oh no. It's like somebody you used to date that it didn't work out with. It's like, hope they don't come over here. It's like, hey, Eddie, hi, yeah, right. Pluto Nash, we did that together. Yeah, good to see you.
I liked Pluto Nash.
Yeah, that was you that liked it.
That was me. That was me in Canada.
Castle Rock wasn't the first studio to die that way, and it wouldn't be the last. But it may be the only one whose death can be pinpointed to a single frame, a single weekend where everyone in the industry looked at a $100 million movie and said, almost in unison, what the hell were they thinking? The most surreal part of Pluto Nash's failure was how quickly it disappeared, not from theaters, but from conversation, from memory, from any sense of public reckoning. It bombed so hard and so completely that it simply ceased to exist in the minds of everyone. For Eddie Murphy, the consequences were more drawn out, but no less severe. The perception, fair or not, was that Murphy no longer cared. From that point on, every new film came with the unspoken qualifier. Is this the one where he tries again? It wasn't until decades later, through interviews, award speeches, and retrospectives, that Murphy began to joke openly about Pluto Nash. He called it a career killer, a tax write-off, the worst thing I ever did. Castle Rock's leadership moved on to other roles. Alan Horn would go on to oversee massive success at Warner and later at Disney, where he helped engineer the Marvel and Star Wars empires. Ron Underwood never directed a major feature again. Rob Reiner returned to directing. The industry didn't learn the right lessons. If anything, it doubled down on the very logic that had produced Pluto Nash: bigger budgets, broader targets, safer stars, louder visuals. Pluto Nash didn't end an era, it predicted one. Today, Hollywood is littered with films made the same way. Top down, brand first, audience second, familiarity over originality. Executives still greenlight projects based on spreadsheets. And for every Barbie or Everything Everywhere All at Once, there are a dozen Moonfalls, Morbiuses, or streaming originals that vanish before their second weekend. Years from now, when streaming platforms have collapsed into each other, when content libraries are sold like real estate, when studios are run by AIs predicting global trends, maybe someone will rediscover Pluto Nash. Maybe they'll try to figure out what went wrong. Maybe they'll think it was just a bad film, but maybe they'll see it for what it really was, a warning no one listened to.